The first store that I want to discuss here is apparently one that was really popular way before I ever ended up visiting it, and actually didn't even focus on the media I remember from my time there. This is called Strawberries Records and Tapes, a music media store that was a big deal back in the 1980s when it was at its peak. Though despite having grown up in New England, I actually had no idea this store was so much of a staple of the scene back then. Apparently it was one of the top 10 music stores in the country and the leader of the market in the New England area at the time. And according to some other articles online, it describes a few of its larger locations in the Boston area being huge two-story buildings. However, the one I remember from my childhood was tucked away in a plaza right between a grocery store and a bank, and the front of the logo was so stylized I could never make out what it actually said as a kid. My distinct memory of the store, besides the wacky logo, was going inside during the early 2000s when the GameCube was out and looking through their strategy guide rack. I'm pretty sure the strategy guides at GameStop were right underneath the checkout counter at the time, so I could never go grab one and read it. But here, they were right in the open. And I remember picking up the Mario Kart Double Dash one, having no idea what was in it, and seeing a screenshot for the first time of King Boo and Petey Piranha as secret unlockable characters. I was so shocked to see that, as a kid. It's one of the only memories I have of the store, but a great one to recollect, because after that, I don't remember going back into it, and I'm not sure how long this location had even been around for at the time. But eventually, I do remember it rebranded as FYE once I got older. In fact, that's what happened to all the Strawberries and several other music store chains once FYE started getting bigger. They would buy them out and rebrand. FYE itself is still around today in decent numbers, but this one in the plaza would eventually close in the early 2010s too. It was a small location, the store stretched really far back, and it wasn't very wide, but I do remember walking there a couple times when I was in high school to get some CDs. They actually had some pretty rare titles that I couldn't find at places like Newberry Comics back then. And of course, the Suncoast at my mall was long gone by that time too. In fact, I think this would be a good segue into the next store I want to talk about, that one being Suncoast. I know Suncoast is one of those obvious choices for defunct stores that get brought up, but I do have some memories of this place as a kid too. I think most people do actually. As a kid, I remember there being two locations near me. One was in a local mall that I went to all the time, and the other one was in a further away mall, but I still remember both. The farther away one was larger, and I only went to it a couple times, but from what I remember, it was such an experience, especially being a small kid. It was a huge location with that 90s style carpet and the dark ceilings, beanbag chairs scattered around, and just a really inviting atmosphere. While I wasn't really buying CDs or DVDs back then, as it would have been the early 2000s, I just remember walking through the whole store and looking at everything. Though I think I actually did get this Nightmare Before Christmas figure set there, which was one of the only places you could even go to get this kind of thing back then. The one in my local mall, I remember a lot more distinctly, because we were there more often, though it was a much smaller location. One of the first aspects you'd notice about it were the TVs in the windows playing either a movie or cartoon. I'm glad to see some photos of this setup exist online, and it wasn't just exclusive to my location. Of course, inside, it had the same setup as the larger location, but it was the merchandise I remember more here. At the time, I remember actually holding some of the now rare Sonic X plushes from Great Eastern Entertainment, which is crazy to think I could have bought them from here. Again, I'm pretty sure this was one of the only places you could have found them back then. There were also a lot of other collector figures, like the ones from Rankin Bass, that have also become valuable over the years, and a lot of those unofficial Beckett Pokemon guides around the counter. Even back in the early 2000s, those were fascinating to look at. But just like how I mentioned before that FYE bought up its competition, the bigger Suncoast actually ended up becoming a dual Suncoast and FYE for a while, with one storefront in the back and the other facing the entrance of the mall, until they both went out. The smaller Suncoast eventually closed completely, before FYE moved into a larger space in that mall, but that eventually closed too. After Suncoast closed in its location, I believe it became some kind of kids' clothing store, and nowadays it's a formal wear shop that I never actually see anyone go into. I have seen videos online of the interior of the surviving Suncoast locations that are still around, and even though the merchandise they sell is nothing you couldn't just buy online or find elsewhere, the idea of walking into a Suncoast in 2024 would be a fun and nostalgic experience. Shifting away from media stores and focusing more on tech-related stores, there are a few that I recall visiting from when I was growing up in relation to video games. And due to the fact that the GameCube and everything related to it was so new to me at the time, I remember a lot of the places I used to go to buy games. One of the more popular spots that I'm sure people will remember is Circuit City, a tech and media store that to my surprise is still around today using its original name. However, it's online only and the actual chain of stores no longer exist. They all closed in 2009. This store is probably best remembered for its tall red towers with the logo placed onto the front, and even nowadays, the one near me that was repainted blue sticks out as originally being used for that. Now I don't remember a lot about the interior of Circuit City, since we were just there for the games, but I do remember that GameCube section quite well. It was a brightly lit area, with GameCube games in those plastic protective cases that you had to bring up to the counter, along with a standing GameCube demo kiosk. This must have been one of, if not the first demo kiosk I ever played. It had Mario Kart Double Dash running, and I picked Yoshi and Donkey Kong to try the game out. This was definitely before my experience in Strawberries, or even having Double Dash to begin with. Instead, we bought Sonic Adventure 2 Battle and Pikmin on this visit. I think my copy of Soul Calibur 2 also came from here, but I have no idea why we even went all the way there when there were plenty of GameStops and EB Games closer. Speaking of EB Games, I definitely remember the one we used to have in our local mall, and even after it rebranded as GameStop, that location stayed in the same spot until 2016. But back when it was EB Games, I remember seeing the very first Nintendo 64 game I ever laid my eyes on. It was a used copy of Mario 64, packaged in this sort of red box with a clear front. I had no idea what it even was at the time. I figured it was some hardcore version of Mario that they had to put on a cart instead of a GameCube disc, and that I didn't have the right setup to play it anyway. I also remember finding the Kelly Toy Mario plushes here for the first time too. They were $9.99 each, which actually felt kind of expensive back then for plushes. Similarly to Circuit City was another tech store called Comp USA, which my dad went to somewhat often back in the day, as there was one near our local mall. I'm not sure how many different tech stores like that were around in the early 2000s, but the one we had near us was huge. And in fact, I remember checking out the GameCube games. Their game section was sort of the opposite of Circuit City though. The lights were darker and the rows were more narrow, but they definitely had a GameCube kiosk, because right above it on a shelf was one of the famous retail Mario display statues. I remember walking into the store as a kid and seeing that all the way from the entrance, wanting to go over and check out the games. I ended up getting closer and looking up at it, just thinking about how cool it would be to own. But alas, we never did. And once the store eventually closed, you bet I wondered whatever happened to it. If I was much older, I probably could have inquired about it, but since I was just a kid and probably didn't even know the store was closing at the time, there was no way to get it. But on the topic of games, video games were not the only type of entertainment media that I remember, because we also had an arcade at that local mall that I seriously regret not exploring as a kid. Back then, I wasn't really into playing games that weren't on GameCube, and the arcade itself was always really loud and noisy, which I hated even walking past. I liked looking at the inside from afar, but never getting closer. A few years ago, I did some research into what this arcade could have been, since I couldn't remember what it was called, and wasn't sure if anyone else online even remembered it. But eventually, I deduced that it had to have been Aladdin's Castle, which was a mall staple back then. Dream Machine was also popular in some malls, but I'm fairly certain based on records online, it was Aladdin's. Now I couldn't tell you what kinds of games they had in there. I remember some sit-down racing ones, but I have no idea if they had anything desired by today's standards, like Marvel vs. Capcom cabinets or anything like that. I do remember a huge center counter where you redeem tickets though, and lots of enormous Gumby and Pokey plushes hanging from the ceiling. There were so many prizes just in that center spot, it was fun looking up and seeing them all. I have no idea what else would have been there at the time in terms of characters, but Gumby was there for sure. And here's a fun fact. The FYE that eventually took up a location in this mall was located in the back of this Aladdin's Castle, since that's how big the store space was. I do remember going into that FYE a couple times, since the noise from the arcade was muffled, but I never ended up getting anything there. Eventually, both locations closed though. I believe Aladdin's closed first, then FYE. until eventually the whole thing became a clothing store stretching from front to back, which is now out of business and is currently a learning center in the back and a slime lab in the front. And speaking of slime, or I guess just learning toys in general, it's hard for me to visit this mall and not think about Noodle Cadoodle and Zany Brainy, two 90s era stores that did have pretty large storefronts from what I remember. I wasn't sure how popular either of these stores were, so I looked them up online, and it does seem like visuals and recollections exist, even some stores that look like they were standalone without being inside of a mall. Actually, I didn't even know these were rival companies until looking them up again, because in that mall, I remember the Noodle Cadoodle location literally changed into Zany Brainy, so I always thought it was just a rebrand. It's fun to remember them, but I personally never liked them a whole lot. I guess I just wasn't really into learning toys as a kid, because aside from the colorful aesthetic, and there just being so many different things to look at, the store always felt boring to me, since it didn't focus on action figures or video games. Though strangely, I have seen advertisements that show Zany Brainy did sell Game Boy products at one point, so maybe they did have a larger presence in the store than I'm able to remember. I do have a Noodle Cadoodle shirt that was probably some kind of promo item from when the store opened, but I don't know if that's actually what it was released for. And here's another fun fact: the founder of Zany Brainy was actually the founder of Five Below as well, which does have a location in this mall currently. So it's fun to think that Zany Brainy lives on in spirit at this same location. And strangely, Zany Brainy looks like it has some kind of legacy site still active, with a shop you can buy some merchandise from, and even an Instagram with photos of all kinds of popular 90s toys on it. I definitely don't remember Crazy Bones or Pokemon cards being in my location. I guess it wouldn't really be a lost store video without a mention of KB Toys. Yeah, I know, it's another one of those commonly remembered spots, but it achieves that status for good reason. I think just about everyone remembers this place for how popular they were, and how many generations of kids they supplied with toys. For me, my most distinct memory of KB Toys goes back to that little plaza with the strawberries in it, as that was my local location, and the one I went to the most. Though unfortunately not all my memories with it were good. A while ago, I made a video that discussed some childhood trauma, and it was in fact this store that caused some of that. As a kid, I really hated animatronics and anything that moved when it wasn't supposed to. And for some reason, every Christmas season, KB Toys had one of those Jemmy Douglas fir trees set up right before you could get into the store. And I can remember many times when I did battle with this thing as a kid. The first time before I knew it was animated, I remember getting close to it, and as you could imagine, how badly it jump scared me. I'm pretty sure I ran out of the store crying that first time. And after that, I would have to wait by the entrance until he finished his song when I knew it was safe before I could go in. And then once I got even more daring, I would duck beneath the display and run underneath him so he wouldn't activate. Aside from the bad memory of Douglas fir, KB Toys was the kind of store you could just browse endlessly in because the aisles were stocked so full of toys. At the time, I was mostly into superhero figures, so I remember looking at those the most. But I believe that's also the place I bought a Gumby Bendy set from, and can remember seeing Joyride Studios figures there as well. Though nothing like the Sonic or Nintendo ones, which I was looking for at the time and only saw at Newberry Comics. These ones were like SSX Tricky in the less popular series. They also had non-scary demo setups of those Weasel Ball motion toys and walking talking puppies that were kinda popular back then. As for video games, I don't think we ever bought any video games from there, but I definitely remember the glass cases of them off to the side, where all the GameCube games were, and a few budget bins where the games were loose. But second to KB Toys is of course Toys R Us, which could probably end up with its own video for how many memories I have of this place growing up. We all need to reminisce about our time in Toys R Us every now and then. The many visits there hunting for Jazzware Sonic figures that seemed way overpriced, and the Jakks Pacific Mario figures when those were first coming out. I did witness my local location prepare for closure though, with all of those game posters being taken off of the walls, and certain areas of the store being blocked off completely. It was a very sad experience, but thankfully I did end up getting some of the Switch banners they had over their games. It's a nice memory to have something that was used in the store like that. Though Toys R Us does still live on, Macy's did keep true to their promise of opening up Toys R Us pop-up locations in their stores, and I frequently visit the one at my local Macy's just to see what they have. To my surprise, they actually carry quite a lot of great Sonic and Mario figures, some of which I've never even seen in main stores like Target before. So it's actually really nice to say I was able to buy figures from Toys R Us in 2024. And if there was ever a defunct location to the LSSQ lore, it would definitely be this next one, because it's literally where the LSSQ name originated from. I've talked about this a few times on live streams before, about where my username comes from, and the story dates back to the mid-2000s, at a place called LaserQuest. This was a name brand laser tag arena that had a few locations in the New England area, but actually originates from the UK, believe it or not. The story goes that for one of my friend's birthday parties in middle school, we were supposed to go to a tubing spot on a snowy mountain, but some rich parents rented out the entire place for their kids for the night. I don't know who thought of it or how it was brought up, but as a backup plan, it was suggested we play laser tag instead, and we went to this now iconic spot. We had so much fun we kept going back, and it was in the following years where the LSSQ name came from. In the game, you get to choose a code name that shows up when you blast an opponent, and at the end, all the point rankings appear on a leaderboard. Ever since the first time we played, I always wanted to reach rank 1 and get my name on the board, and by complete coincidence, the first time I ever hit rank 1 was when I was using the code name Supersonic. It was a name that meant something to me, and when it came time to pick my username for YouTube a few years later, Supersonic is what I went with. But I wanted to pick something that was more distinct than just Supersonic, and realized that LaserQuest abbreviated their name as LQ, so I wanted to incorporate that into my name. I tried LQ Supersonic and Supersonic LQ until eventually splitting it up as LSuperSonicQ, and the name stuck. Though unfortunately to this day, LaserQuest itself is abandoned with its sign torn at the top. Though the door isn't boarded up, so you can actually look inside and see all of the original structures and layout. But all the props and signs are gone. I asked one of the reps of the company on Facebook if I could grab some of the props or look inside when they first announced their closure, and while they said they would keep me updated, I never heard back. I suspect it was the craziness of 2020 that did them in, on top of the fact that laser tag had been declining, at least in this location, for many years after we first started going. From mall staples to local favorites, and even short-term spots, if you remember any of these stores or have your own memories of a place that I didn't mention, feel free to comment them down below. But even though I'll never get to play LaserQuest with that Supersonic codename there again, at least I'll always have a memento of my time at a now defunct and lost retail location. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to check out some of my other Lost Media videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Finn.